Rahman was charged to lead the Islamic Research Institute. His stances on issues such as mechanical slaughter, riba, and the drinking of alcohol led to considerable consternation among the ulama. Rahman was viewed as attributing the Quran squarely to the personhood of Muhammad. Rahman's belief in Muhammad's divine inspiration coming from within, ultimately led to widespread accusations of heresy. Ultimately, Rahman was forced to relinquish his chairmanship of the institute and begin a professional career abroad. Due to his training in both traditional Islamic sciences as well as Islamic philosophy, along with his institutional prominence in the nascent Pakistani state, I think Fazlur Rahman can be considered an ideal representative when considering the hermeneutics of Islamic modernism before the Islamic Revolution. These type of modernists could allow Islam and the state to have a certain degree of independence. But as opposed to Islamic modernists thought after the revolution, this strain of Islamic modernism has a greater degree of faith that the state will ultimately fashion itself and its citizens along those rationalist lines conceived by the philosopher. So my talk also today is about the limits of the philosopher and philosophy and the intellectual to unilaterally form a state along philosophy's self-image. So what kind of hermeneutics? I'm leaving out a lot of the Shabistari history for obvious reasons. If one accepts that Islamic modernism consists of a mutual intellectual endeavor challenging those texts and authorities held in revered esteem by more traditionally trained religious scholars, as Usman Qasmi points out, it becomes apparent that intellectuals also felt the imperative to devise alternative modes of reading interpretation suitable for meeting such a challenge. While sacred texts such as the Quran were to remain revered as the basis for the Islamic religion, the epistemic space from which they were to be read needed to be reformulated. No longer could practices of reading and assumptions of divine truth remain unscrutinized, nor could legitimate hermeneutical issues be obfuscated by reams of texts produced by the ulama, the understanding of which remains dependent on the ulama's technical expertise for both physical retrieval and proper utilization. So this is also an attempt to gain independence from the ulama. The Pakistani modernists in particular could not relinquish discussion over the nature of textual interpretation to an ulama class long bereft of an innovative legal spirit such as the hadith as the primary source of religious guidance and legal authority. The problematic that occupied many modernist Islamic thinkers appears to be the extent to which they are content to place them in philosophy, or alternatively, whether they were obligated by their philosophic commitments, cultivated in part by their Western education, to formulate an alternative epistemic position for which to bring a greater elasticity into contemporary Islam. Like most modernists, Islamic or otherwise, Rahman and Shabistari criticized traditional authority by reinterpreting the essence of those foundational elements upon which traditional authorities claim legitimacy. They would prove for one reason or another that their modes of recovering those original sources and concepts have a significant impact on their meaning and relevance for modern believers, a meaning which has unfortunately been lost over time. In Islam, those origins would include prophecy, the reality of divine revelation, and the substrate of the Quranic text, three main elements. In doing so, they call into question those subsequent authoritative developments within the religious tradition, the ulama, which have led to a rigidity of faith along with an impotence in meeting the demands of the modern world on the part of Islam. Of course, such scholarly efforts themselves rarely admit to being motivated or guided by external historical exigency. The modernists do try to present their interpretive positions in the most organic light. Both Rahman and Shabistari maintain that the Islamic tradition has yet to formally produce an internal religious science dealing exclusively with the epistemic assumptions involved in interpretation. But while Rahman turned to the basic epistemological assumptions of Islamic philosophy in order to ground modern faith, Shabbastari's embrace of a hermeneutics of doubt and plurality alongside traditional Islamic sciences provides his Quranic interpretation with an altogether different hue. So the question here is really how does Islamic philosophy, whose main development was in the Middle Ages, become relevant or not today? By rejecting the notion of transcendent truth embedded in the Greek-inspired conception of history assumed by medieval Islamic philosophy, Shabbastari ultimately succeeds in creating an epistemic space more attentive to the demands of the present, I think, personally. 20 minutes, 15 to finish reading? 15 minutes. Summarize. Okay, I didn't think we had such little time. Okay. Rahman was indeed critical of Islamic philosophy. He was dismayed at its failure to convert its esoteric ideals into an ethical message capable of meeting the often intellectual arguments by orthodoxy that were themselves often quite rigorous. Their interpretation of revelation as the conduit for divine command to translate itself into law, compels a political response from philosophy itself, a response that it was incapable, unwilling, or perhaps even legitimately afraid to give in the Middle Ages. His masterful reconstruction of medieval debates on the subject can be found in his 1958 book, Prophecy and Islam. Yet Rahman is ultimately concerned with creating a hermeneutics tasked with translating what he terms pure cognition into the recognition of something else, which he terms historical value. So cognition, but not in the moment of its cognition, but its durability over time. And as we've seen in the Islamic tradition, it hasn't been that durable. Rahman writes in his brief and dense methodological prologue to another book, Islam and Modernity, that, quote, the use of the term historical values must be made clear. All values that are properly moral, and it is with these that we shall be concerned, also have an extra-historical, transcendental being, and their location at a point in history does not exhaust their practical impact, or one might say even their meaning. By referencing, quote, pure cognition and affirming the presence of an extra-historical, transcendent being, it appears that Rahman is referring, in perhaps an oblique fashion, to the Neoplatonic conception of the divine Godhead and its apprehension at various levels of intellectual acuity by the prophet and subsequent great philosophic intellects. So this is the aql that we've been talking about over the course of our program. But on what basis is the modern Islamic intellectual capable of discerning this trans-historical element in the first place? Rahman makes the case that the Islamic tradition provides a historically oriented framework for, quote, a double movement from the present situation to the Quranic time and then back to the present. The ability to read history through the juxtaposition of past and present is mediated by a supremely authoritative Quranic text and a proper understanding of the historical circumstances surrounding its creation. Such a text would function as the gateway for achieving an extra-historical, trans-historical sense of rational perception. Subsequent interpretation would only strengthen that faculty. Indeed, Rahman understands the principle of ijtihad in a similar vein, identifying it as, quote, the effort to understand, from Prophecy in Islam, the effort to understand the meaning of a relevant text or precedent in the past containing a rule, and to alter that rule by extending or restricting or otherwise modifying it in such a manner that a new situation can be subsumed under it by a new solution. I'm going to repeat that. It's a very, very complicated sentence. So, ijtihad is the effort to understand the meaning of a relevant text or precedent in the past, containing a rule. The precedent contains a rule. And to alter that rule by extending, restricting, or otherwise modifying it in such a manner that a new situation can be assumed under it by a new solution. And I'm sure that definition is quite debatable. It is premature at this point to discuss Rahman's specific conception of Quranic unity and its relationship to the prophecy or personhood of Muhammad. Yet a few important remarks on his hermeneutical philosophy can nevertheless be made. For Rahman, history is a rather stable epistemological category capable of connecting the present with the past. Universal and transhistorical themes can be identified in those texts which are considered a priori as ideal for their times. Objectivity of historical circumstance and the intellectual's discerning of general principles relevant to the present from such a past do not contradict each other in any way. In this fashion, the world-weary philosopher of the medieval ages is able to emerge as the ethicist intellectual of the present. You see, so we have world-weary wants to, dhawq, aql, go into that territory where he's as close to the divine and apart from the exigencies of governance, of managing society, to a public intellectual who's concerned with public ethics. At this point in the methodological prologue to Islam and modernity, Rahman feels confident enough to launch into a full attack on Gadamerian subjectivity. And so I know I need to do more contextual work on Gadamer, textual work on Gadamer to link him with Rahman. But I hope you'll excuse me at this point. So he cites he wants to ally himself with an objectivist hermeneutical theory against Gadamer. So in the sort of Gadamer debates, the scholar like Betty, who's the objectivist scholar against Gadamer. Rahman states that the process of understanding is a reversal of the original creative process. The forms we try to understand and interpret now are to be led back to a creative mind whose original contents they were, not as isolated items, but as a coherent whole, and made to live out again in the mind of the understanding subject. Rahman denies Gadamer's charge that such an approach would constitute a psychologism. It's not psychology, instead suggesting a rather daring inversion of one of Gadamer's chief methodological claims, the sort of historical contingency and apprehension by the subjective perspective of the cognating mind. Rahman proposes that instead of viewing historical circumstance as a conditioning factor upon the author of a given text, the present reader must use the interpretive tools of both the critical historian and also the ethicist to understand the effect an author of a particular text has had on his respective surroundings. So that it's an author-dominated historical reality. So the historical reality doesn't necessarily, sort of in the balance between historical reality and the author, it is more the author which is imparting himself onto the historical reality rather than the historical reality conditioning him. Human subjects do not find themselves within history, and the space between present and past is rational in character rather than historical. So he believes in the Islamic philosophers who say there's one aql. There's no historically conditioned aql, but there's aql over time, and historical circumstance is subsumed by it. Such claims can only come from an intellectual welded to the ideals of classical Islamic philosophy and committed to a state finally willing to translate philosophy into practice. Thus, it remains doubtful whether, as critics like Ibrahim Ozdemir have argued, that Rahman's critique can be deemed as truly emancipatory and comparable to the democratic critiques of domination provided by contemporary Western philosophers such as Jürgen Habermas. Now I'm going to, and I go on about that here, but I'm going to skip Özdemir's critique for now. Mujtahid Shabestari, on the other hand, fully embraces the Gadamerian embraces a Gadamer interpretive subjectivity, while nonetheless granting authoritative power and internal truth to foundational texts such as the Quran. The binding of those seemingly contradictory elements give his Quranic hermeneutics an interpretive strength lacking in the ethics of reading proposed by Rahman. Additionally, Shabastari will empower individual Muslims within their respective historical moments and provide them with a locus of epistemic sovereignty firmly rooted in the traditional but nonetheless ijtihad-friendly version of Islam. It is a hermeneutic uniquely suited to assimilate contemporary notions of human rights and justice and engage with the Islamic State despite the state's natural desire to control and dominate and regulate, let's say regulate religion and politics. Like Rahman, Shabastari is insistent that an authoritative text be viewed in terms of a unity. He writes that, quote, and this is from a text called Qira'at al-Nabawi as Jahan, and that's where most of my quotes from Shabastari come from, and that's his latest text. The center of meaning cannot be discovered unenlightened and without a test or criterion. The method of discovery is precisely to question history or to place one's ear to history. The text can only be considered as a unit